not a secret that people really love coffee. I love coffee. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, more people are drinking more of it since 2015 at about 3 cups of coffee per day. And we're not even in the top 20 most people countries that drink it in weight. But there's still this prevalent common belief that even just 1 cup of coffee a day is really excessive and carries like serious health risks. But while pretty much anything in excess is unhealthy, the risk specifically attributed to drinking coffee daily actually originates from outdated and misguided studies. Drinking large amounts of coffee, in truth, actually doesn't really carry increased health risks, as well as there's actually provable links between coffee consumption and actual health benefits. Therefore, the health risks of drinking a cup of coffee a day are actually overstated. My first point is that part of the scientific method is to publish results so others can recreate it for verification, which may be a possible reason as to why those aforementioned coffee studies were eventually retested even though they are believed. Whatever the case, after newer, more updated coffee studies were conducted, it was actually really commonly found that the earlier conducted studies were wrong or misleading with their results, because many of these researchers actually found in the recent studies that they attribute the misinformation to the fact that the studies either didn't actually take into account enough variables, or they had the participants drink like overly ludicrous amounts of coffee, like 7 cups per day, or some combination of both of that. These ignored variables actually included like frequent smoking and obesity, which are obviously logically able to skew health risk results. And this is, to be more specific, in 2017, Henry Mayo, Dr. Donald Hess quoted that these earlier studies didn't always take into account known high-risk behaviors, such as smoking and physical inactivity, and which tends to actually be more common around heavy coffee drinkers. There was also echoed later in 2017 by another Harvard Medical School Dr. Robert Schmerling, who's further specified that the studies linking coffee consumption to diseases have observed it with overly high consumption, as well as they didn't even take into account smoking or other concerns such as modest and temporary elevations in blood pressure just from getting up and moving around during testing, or faster than normal heart rhythms that people may have from other health risks that they have. And he goes on to state that, in fact, some of these older studies actually are taught about raising red flags about fishing expeditions and weak research methodology. So coffee is actually used to teach that. And that actually goes to my second point about the cancer link, because he does mention it also, Dr. Schmerling. He says it's a very common belief coming from studies in the 1980s, but there isn't actually a link between coffee consumption and increased heart disease or cancer rates, because Dr. Hensworm from earlier states that recent studies have just generally found no connection between coffee and increased risk of heart disease or cancer. And the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report from 2015 actually specified that even 350 milligrams of caffeine per day, which is about 1 to 5 cups, is actually inversely associated with heart risk. And they found that with 5 different studies that they conducted. And the next year, the World Health Organization actually released a bulletin where they officially removed coffee from the World Carcinogen List. And they just plainly state that there's no conclusive evidence for a carcinogenic effect on drinking coffee or even mate, which is another plant-based infusion. And then drinking large amounts of coffee doesn't even increase risk of mortality or death, because each new study that more accurately accounts for multiple variables are finding that there's not a link between coffee drinking and death. Another Harvard School of Public Health study led by Frank Hugh and 3 large cohorts in 2015 stated that a multivariate adjusted analysis showed a nonlinear association between consumption of caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee and all-cause mortality in the overall population. And they went to continue to say that moderate coffee consumption is being associated with lower mortality risk, and high coffee consumption not being associated with mortality risk at all. And as well, the Dietary Guidelines from 2015 goes far as deeming 3 to 5 cups a day or even 400 milligrams of caffeine as just moderate and a safe range. And there's no strong evidence associated with long-term health risk in a reasonably healthy individual. And which brings me to my last point. All these studies that I've mentioned, they're really significant because they're not only finding that there are not these previously believed links between coffee and health risks of various diseases, but there's actually a definitive link between drinking coffee and health benefits. Coffee consumption has been known to improve mental health. Dr. Hensman from earlier also found that coffee tends to improve cognitive function and decrease the risk of depression. And a research nutritionist from Johns Hopkins University, Diane Fitztham, states that the caffeine in 2 cups of coffee may provide significant protection against Alzheimer's because researchers found that women 65 and older who drank 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day were less likely to develop dementia in general. As well as touched upon before, coffee consumption has known to reduce the risk of various diseases, such as type 2 diabetes and heart disease, as found by the Dietary Committee report, which found that the coffee associated with reduced risk from type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And there's even a moderate association between Parkinson's disease and reduced risk, as well as Dr. Henson earlier from Henry Mayo mentioned that coffee protects against Parkinson's disease and type 2 diabetes, as well as liver disease and liver cancer. And as to why this may be the case, in 2011, research nutritionist Diane Fitztham put out another article stating that coffee contains antioxidants and other active substances that may reduce internal inflammation and protect against all these diseases. And that's why the abundance of these new studies around coffee, as well as the dissection of these previous studies, shows that we can conclude that health risks of drinking coffee daily were previously overstated.
All right, there's a lot of introductory material that kind of suggests one direction and then a slightly different direction, and then you finally present your proposition. I thought that was a little more confusing than it needed to be. There's sort of a preview, but it needs to be clearer. When you get to the body of the speech, I'm not exactly sure that you signpost that first point. The second and the third points are signposted. The third point, though, is really, there's a claim there, but the claim comes after you've presented a claim. The claim that you present talks about how the studies are significant, but the real argument here is that there are a link to benefits. So that should be the secondary claim on the third point. The thing that's strongest about your argument is the quality of the evidence that you're citing. You're very good at citing the authorities, the sources that the information comes from. There's a nice, at first on the first point, I was a little concerned because there's a general criticism of the earlier research that had been done that suggested there are all these reasons why we shouldn't be trusting these things, and it all sounded like you were asserting that. But then, kind of separate, you started presenting information that talked about how these studies had, in fact, had problems. So it seems like that maybe you could integrate the evidence with the claims a little bit more on that first point. After that, though, you were more consistent about integrating the claims, and again, you were very consistent about citing the sources. And I thought that, you kind of, it's almost a refutation speech answering arguments instead of making an advanced argument about the benefits of coffee. It's 2/3 of it is really a refutation of the criticisms of coffee consumption. All right, and the time's off a little bit, but let's not worry about that. Let's move on to the next.